Welcome to So What's It Actuary About? I'm your host, Margie Mchechny, and I, along with my wide array of guests, hope to help you better understand and weather the wonderful world of actuarial science. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's episode. We are joined by Shivani. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Margie. It's such a delight to be here.
I'm really excited about this. To start off the interview, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background. Don't even mention actuarial, just your background, something about you, and then we'll get into the actuarial side of it.
Well, probably the thing we'll end up talking about quite a lot today is that I'm a meditator.
Yes, I'm very excited.
So that is a big part of my life at the moment. Mm-hmm. It's been a long journey to arrive here. Mm-hmm. But my meditation practice and my breath work, so I'm currently doing my breath work training.
Okay.
So that's, it's a really significant part of who I am.
It's amazing. So for our listeners, as you listen towards the end of today's episode, Shivani is actually going to take us through a breathing exercise, and I'm very excited about that. But I know Shivani. My first interaction with you as a name was, I don't even know if you remember this, but I was doing an honors seminar at Wits, and I was allocated one of your papers. And I had to present it, and I emailed you a dispatch your results, and that was my first interaction with you. And so at that time, I think you were at UCT, and you were, I think, in a lecturing position there, and you'd be doing some research. So you've obviously been in the academic space, but let's backtrack a little bit. Why actuarial science?
Gosh, Margie, actually for mostly quite silly reasons.
I think I can attest to that as well.
Yeah. So I actually really wanted to do medicine, which plays out actually in the rest of my story.
Yes.
Because I've always, even working as an actuary, I've always worked in healthcare.
Yes.
So I've always had this draw to, I guess all the levels of it actually. So an interest in the body, interest in health systems.
And well-being.
And well-being.
Yeah.
And care. So so what happened was, in the process of applying to do medicine,
yes,
back in the 90s, needed to do some community work as part of my application.
All right.
And made, I was going to say I'd make the mistake, but I'm not sure that's true, but made the decision to do my community work at what's called CHOC, that's the Children's Hematology and Oncology Centre in Johannesburg, which is, children who are severely ill. And found it heartbreaking, actually, and found it too much for a 16-year-old version of myself. And extrapolated from that to be like, I don't think I'm cut out for this career.
Sure.
And then, switched. I mean, I think actually for a lot of subconscious reasons. My dad is an insurance broker.
Okay, so there was some sort of bias that came into that.
Yes, definitely. And then I had was very fortunate to have a bursary. I had a bursary with the now extinct Southern Life, which is wonderful because I built a relationship there with Irene Petroni, who was a very significant person in my career journey. But because I had the bursary, actually stuck with it, even though I didn't love it and wasn't particularly good at the university part of it.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure. I think if I hadn't had the bursary, I probably would. I really loved the pure mathematics, really loved the economics. Probably would have switched to something along those lines. But I stuck with it.
Sure.
And then, went on to fulfill the work obligations afterwards of the bursary.
Yes.
And I had to work off that debt. And in that process, kind of found the area of application of actuarial science that resonated with me. But it took a while.
And you said you didn't really enjoy your studies. What is it that you didn't enjoy about it? Did it just seem a bit detached from what you wanted to do and that sort of well-being aspect that you've sort of indicated?
Yes. So, I mean, it's actually interesting because it comes up later in research I did when I was an academic.
Yes.
But this it's actually very well thought through idea in the education literature about what's called an inverted curriculum.
Yes.
Which seems to resonate more with women and people of colour.
Yes.
But it's actually where you start with explaining the why.
Why
do we do all of this?
Yes.
Why do we do all of the statistics? But when I studied, that wasn't the way the curriculum was structured.
Yes.
And
It was
very much
just the technical basis.
and that is how a lot of kind of STEM fields are structured.
Yeah.
It's like you've got to acquire quite technical, theoretical. I mean, a lot of it's theoretical. Actually, it wasn't even like we were doing regressions sort of practically using statistical software.
Yeah.
It was the theorems that underpin it. So theoretical statistics, theoretical mathematics, with not much of a sense of how it would actually relate to the world.
Yeah.
So that's just one part of it. The other part of it, I think, for me is actually only realizing as an adult, and actually only realizing, I think, through parenting, and how my brain works. So, my brain likes to have a map and be able to see how things relate to each other.
Very connection-based and relationship-based.
I have a very relational brain,
Yeah.
very sort of systems brain. So I struggled a lot, particularly the first time I did a course, to understand even how the whole course hung together.
Yes, like where does this fit in? How is this topic related to this topic?
Yes, and why are we doing this topic?
Yeah.
So it was only actually with often doing a course for a second time, and actually it got better as I progressed through the subject, because then the blocks started to sort of come together.
Okay.
So by the time I finished my degree, I had a much better sense of mastery, of a sense of actually I understand how this body of knowledge
And you had
hangs
pieces
together.
of the map, right?
Yes, I had pieces of. So as
It starts emerging,
Yes.
whereas in the beginning you're like, I see nothing. Like you're just giving me these odd puzzle pieces.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure if they all fit together in the end.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that then later fed into when I became an academic, how I thought about teaching.
Yes.
And I think made me a good teacher, because I had I guess a sympathy for understanding, particularly students who come from backgrounds where they haven't been exposed to financial services, haven't been exposed.
It's not intuitive.
It's not intuitive at all. It's really not. And even the functioning of the markets. There's a lot that's taken for granted.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, I think of it as quite a sort of fundamentalist belief system. There's like a belief in the functioning of the markets in capitalism. That
Efficient market hypothesis.
and it's, you're sort of meant to just take on this belief system without really being sort of stepped through it and what it actually means and how it plays out in the world and how it plays out in your world. If you come from a poor background, how does this system impact your part?
Exactly. Is it actually not applicable to you at all, or is it? Yeah, I think it was
detrimental to you.
Exactly.
Now you're meant to engage in something that is actually harm to your people.
Yes. Yeah. And it can be very personal. I think something that's also interesting that I found in teaching is like the words that we use and how often we just assume that our audience understands certain words, and they don't. And that can also be another barrier that you create. And I think I've become more sympathetic to that, in that I'll lecture something and just say a word and just continue. And then I've lost people because I haven't necessarily thought about their background and thinking, okay, maybe this wasn't a word that they engaged with regularly, given their background. And so I think it is important to think about your students and where they come from in those engagements.
My favorite example of that is the word equity.
Yes.
Which when you're speaking actuarial means you're talking about shares.
Yeah, shares.
Yeah, but the equity market.
And they're thinking about equality.
Fairness and justice.
And they're like, it has cash flows? What do you mean? Yeah, it's true. I mean, very, very interesting thing to think about. But let's talk through now your actuarial career post having finished your studies. What did that look like? You said that you had to work in order to pay off your debt, but how did that sort of trajectory go about?
So strange, actually, in preparing for the podcast, just thinking about that and realizing, actually, in retrospect, how eclectic it will sound, I think. But how each decision kind of made sense as I went through that career path. But actually there is a coherence that I can now see when I look back.
Yes, maybe not at the time.
No, yes. So I was very, very fortunate in my final year of study that Professor Heather McLeod was an academic at GCT, and she ended up being my honours supervisor.
How incredible.
It was so incredible. And she such a pioneer as a healthcare actuary. So health at that stage wasn't actually one of the fellowship areas that you could specialize in. So it was relatively new. But also somebody with such a strong orientation to social solidarity.
Yes.
And now actually, she lives in New Zealand, like very strong participant in Indigenous knowledge systems and climate change. Yeah, so she's, so really not the sort of typical actuarial orientation.
Which is so inspiring.
So inspiring. And actually was such a relief, I think, like in my body to meet her, because even the way she dressed and, she wore these kind of loose caftans and she was an underwater photographer.
Love it.
And was very clear about her spiritual orientation, had trained, as a homeopath and an Ayurvedic healer. So she was a healer and a dynamic person. Yeah, so given my call to health and healing, then so lucky to have found somebody who carried this in them.
So early on.
So early on. So I actually stayed on. I managed to delay my date for a little bit, and I stayed on for a year and worked for her as a research assistant.
Okay.
Which was amazing. And at that stage, the medical scheme environment had just been reformed along social solidarity principles.
Okay, so that was the community rating, exactly. 5 minimum benefits.
Yes, okay. So all of that. So the Medical Schemes Act of 2000.
Yes.
So I was involved in research very early on to look at the impact and like how the market was responding.
It must be so interesting.
It was absolutely fascinating, and also built a relationship with the regulator, with the Council of Medical Schemes,
which is such an interesting sort of space to be in, because you realize that those interactions with various governing bodies determine how we work as actuaries.
Yes.
So incredible exposure so early on in your career again.
And so fortuitous, and actually, you'll see how all of these things kind of thread through. And then the company that I had the bursary with, Southern Life, had been taken over by Momentum.
Okay.
Momentum didn't do a lot in health at that stage, and the only job they could offer me was in Centurion.
Okay.
And I really didn't want to go to Centurion.
Fair enough.
So I interviewed for a few jobs and managed to get my bursary bought out by Sanlam Health.
Yeah.
So I went and worked for Sanlam Health, and almost immediately when I started there, that business had been bought by a company called MedScheme.
Oh, good grief.
So my dad kind of moved from Sanlam to Momentum to Sanlam to MedScheme pretty much before I'd done a day of work. So I spent the first 3 years of my career doing quite traditional healthcare actuarial work. So pricing, reserving, product design, all of those things, looking at the value of managed care interventions. So I was really fortunate because it was still relatively early on. So a lot of systems and tools weren't built.
Yes. So it's very innovative work.
Very innovative work. So Sanlam Health was amazing because they had set up a data warehouse like very early on. But MedScheme actually hadn't. MedScheme's identity at the time was very much just as an administrator of claims. So they weren't actually interested in data.
So they were just like a system.
It was
they were just
a processing. It wasn't transactional. It was transactional. It was literally the capability to have a claim come in, most of which came in, believe it or not, like on paper.
I know.
So mail room.
I know. Oh yeah.
And then just to be able to pay the claim, and no real interest in
the data and the analytics and
which is, it's quite radical when you think about it today and how much data there is and how much amazing.
It was a primary role of administrators nowadays.
Absolutely.
To sort of pulling insights from that data.
Yes. So I was involved in the establishment of that data warehouse and thinking about how the data was structured. So it was incredible exposure. And then also having to build things like the reserving. That spread, in those days we still used spreadsheets, but
like the structure of it, isn't it?
To actually build the spreadsheet, and then a few years later, people would say, "Oh, yes, I still use the model that you built." But the depths of learning that I had,
and first principle thinking,
absolutely.
And I'm just taking over someone else's model. There's that element of like, okay, what is the crux of what I'm trying to do, which I think is a very core skill that some actuarial analysts may not get that exposure to, because you're just taking over someone else's model, or you're a cog in a much larger team, and so I think that must have been quite sort of framing for you with regard to what actuaries actually can do.
I think the cog in the larger machine is a big thing, because the analytical teams are so big these days now that you typically are just looking at one portion of it, where I was incredibly lucky to have such wide ranging. In 3 years, I worked across the full